Is our China investment safe? That is a question heard more frequently in German boardrooms these days, as political tensions over Taiwan are rising, along with regulatory pressure and competition on the Chinese market. Mid-sized companies in particular, which are the backbone of Germany's economy, seem to reassess their China exposure.
Entrepreneur Andreas Jäger has been active on the Chinese market for more than 20 years. His company manufactures rubber and plastic parts, like hoses for wastewater plants and seals for solar systems. 90% of all solar plants come from China, and half of all wastewater treatment plants worldwide are built in China. Our products are for biological wastewater treatment, which means it's an important market for us so far. The family-owned company from Hanover, Germany, has its own factory in China. But Jäger says it's not dependent on business there. He admits this is not typical for other operators in the German industry. The fact that China is one of the largest markets in the world can be seen as a blessing or a curse. German industry has developed very well in China over the last 20 years, and many jobs here in Germany depend in a certain way on China. But the question is, aren't there alternative markets that complement China? The question applies to every entrepreneur at the moment. A concern within the business community is that China could attack Taiwan. That would be a red line for Andreas Jäger. His company also does business in the U.S., so it's similarly dependent on American politics. If China were to attack, Jäger would have to make a decision. We would probably try to scale down our activities in China to such an extent that we would not be affected by the American sanctions. Jäger wants to keep producing in China. At the same time, he's trying to open up other markets in places like India and Indonesia and spread his entrepreneurial risk as widely as possible.
I'll be talking to an expert on China policy here in a moment. First, here's our correspondent on the question of whether he thinks China is becoming a riskier bet for foreign investors because of growing regional tensions.
For the first time in decades, some companies and investors have begun to consider whether the risks of investing in China outweigh the potential benefits. And with China's top leader Xi Jinping calling for stronger national security and restrictions on information available to foreign governments and companies, the Chinese government itself is accelerating decoupling. Foreign investors are not going to be comfortable working in that environment if they feel their operations are constantly and unexpectedly disrupted.
DW correspondent Tsang speaking from Taipei there. Now, before the show, I spoke to Steve Tsang, director of the SOAS China Institute in London, and I asked him how risky it was for foreign companies to invest in China currently.
It will depend on what industry you are engaged in. If you are still engaged in the kind of innovative industries that China needs desperately, the Chinese government will still create a good environment for you. But if you are engaged in industries where the Chinese themselves have the technology, then you don't have a right to make huge profits any longer.
Let's look at the second part that you mentioned there. Now, in these time of heightened political tensions, Volkswagen reportedly wants to work together with Chinese tech firms like Huawei to provide software for its electric vehicle fleet in China. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there is still potentially scope for that collaboration as long as Huawei is driving it. And Huawei is not losing control over its technology, but is making Volkswagen dependent on Huawei technology, particularly if that technology will be used for the export of vehicles built by Volkswagen inside China or indeed even outside of China. It will enhance Huawei technological base.
Steve, as long as Huawei is driving this technology, did I understand you correctly there?
Yes. The idea that Huawei would hand over the technologies to any foreign car company, I don't think is terribly realistic. Huawei will want to be in control of it.
But it's quite a conundrum that foreign firms find themselves in here, right? I mean, you have growing pressure from domestic competitors on the electrical vehicle market, for example, and which would call for more investment. At the same time, the political demand in Germany, for example, is to downsize the once profitable China exposure.
Well, I think the need is for companies like Volkswagen to strike a balance both between the needs of China and the needs of their home country, as well as a balance between the short term and the long term. In the short term, it's easier simply to work with a Chinese partner like Huawei, but in the longer term, the Huawei's control over the technology could be a serious problem for a company like Volkswagen. But that is really a longer-term problem rather than an immediate short-term problem.
Do you see bigger concerns about China investments among mid-sized firms as compared to large multinationals, for example?
Well, the Chinese government would really be focusing much more on the technology rather than the size of the foreign companies. Whether you're talking about medium-sized companies or huge conglomerates, when you are dealing with the Chinese system, then the Chinese system is usually rather bigger than your big multinationals, and therefore they can still have an edge over you.